The Corporate Counsel Show, an in-depth look at the issues facing in-house legal professionals, brought to you by Lawyers Weekly.
Hello and welcome to a special episode of The Corporate Counsel Show, produced in partnership with our friends at LegalVision. My name's Jerome Doraisamy and I'm coming to you today from Camaragal land in Sydney, and I'm very pleased to be joined for this conversation by Emmanuel Giuffre, who is the General Manager and Head of Legal at LegalVision. This is his second appearance on the podcast, I believe. Manny, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me, Jerome. And thank you for inviting me back again.
Yeah, well, it's lovely to have you, and it's great to have LegalVision on board as a partner for our upcoming Corporate Counsel Summit, which hopefully all of you listeners have already purchased tickets to. Now, we are going to be discussing how best legal teams can be managing their legal, ethical, and professional concerns as they are adopting the myriad artificial intelligence platforms in this weird and wonderful time that we're currently living in. It'll be great to hear a bit more from Manny about how best your teams can be striking the right balance as you look to better implement all of these new technologies. Manny, before we sort of delve into some of the nitty-gritty here, I'm curious to know why you think this is such an important conversation for us to be having at this juncture, and you know, why LegalVision more broadly thinks it's so important to have this kind of check-in.
Yeah, great. Look, well, can I start by saying that it is just such an exciting time, not just for in-house counsel, but for the entire profession. As you know, LegalVision has always been a pioneer in the new law and legal tech space, and have for a very long time been focused on how we can use systems, processes and new technology like AI to transform legal services for our clients, and also transform the delivery of legal services for our lawyers. And so, look, very pleased to be part of this conversation. And I suppose to answer your question, why is it such an important time now to be having this conversation? Over the past 2-3 months, we've actually gone on a bit of a roadshow. So the LegalVision team has met with GCs and leaders of in-house legal teams across the country, talking to them about this very topic, how they're using AI, what is their sentiment towards the technology, and what are some of the legal and ethical considerations that they are all needing to think about when using it. And it's clear that there is a lot of concern out there. People are acknowledging that AI is here to stay. Yeah. They're acknowledging that there are so many benefits that they can derive from using the technology, but there is still some concern around these ethical and legal implications, and so they need assistance in sort of navigating them.
Absolutely, and it'd be great to delve a bit deeper into some of those sentiments that you're hearing, across the country, from law departments, big and small, because as you've alluded to, AI is this shiny new toy that everyone is talking about, everyone is using, and things are developing at such a frenetic speed that it's really hard to keep up with not only what those developments are, but how best to leverage them and ensure that your legal team can flourish. So without naming names of those lawyers and those businesses, what are the the headline concerns or reflections that you're hearing on the ground?
Yeah, no, look, it's been really eye-opening having these conversations with GCs. Look, overwhelmingly, I would say the sentiment has shifted from one of skepticism, which was absolutely the sentiment that was resonating from the industry or from the market, I would say 2 years ago. Yep. It's now certainly shifted from skepticism to now accepting AI is here to stay, but also having this cautious optimism. The recognition that AI has so much potential to completely transform in-house practice for the better. And I would say a lot of in-house counsel and in-house leaders are looking at AI as being a tool that can free them from some of that routine, really reactive, really BAU legal work, and therefore lean into the more proactive and more strategic work that is really going to be value adding for the business, which is really exciting. Yeah. And then I would say some of the caution is certainly coming from those legal, ethical, and professional responsibility concerns, but also around being left behind. So I'm hearing particularly from smaller in-house legal teams, they have concerns around not having the time to be able to invest in these tools or to educate themselves around how to use the tools. But also that they're struggling with budgets and business buy-in. Yeah. And I feel like that's really the challenge that a lot of in-house legal teams are struggling with. There's a really interesting concept, which I don't know if you've heard of it, Jerome, called the jagged frontier of capability. Have you heard of that?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, right. So this is from Ethan Mollick. He's a professor at Wharton and a real pioneer in the space of AI. And he talks about, this jagged frontier of capability. And as we know, AI is very good at certain things. It's also not particularly good at other things. And so when you have a team of, say, for example, lawyers or teams within businesses using AI, they may have very different experiences. Some may have really positive experiences and others initially might have very negative ones. And of course, because they are approaching the use of this technology from different positions, it could actually be very difficult to get business buy-in and to implement it at an organisational level from a change management perspective.
Yeah, so what's really interesting for me in listening to you talk there is that the concerns are not just about how best to use AI and these and these shiny new toys, but it's also about the perceptions of that utilization. The legal department has long had issues with showcasing their value to other business functions, and I imagine now there's probably a bit of additional pressure by way of other teams assuming that they're using AI and therefore they can give these answers yesterday, and probably also with some of those financial constraints that have also long been concerns and challenges that they may be expected to maybe reduce headcount if they're able to use these new technologies, and of course that brings with it its own problems as well. So the utilization piece of this, it seems to be really layered.
Yes, absolutely. And look, going back onto perceptions, I do believe that we should be really excited by this technology. Yes, there are going to be some people who have very positive experiences, other people have very negative ones, but I think we can all rest assured that this is the worst the technology is ever going to be.
Oh, that's a good point.
The model that you are seeing today,
I hadn't thought of that.
Of course, the model that you're seeing today is only going to get smarter, faster, cheaper, more reliable. And so we can all sort of rest assured that, yes, what we're using now may not be necessarily perfect, and there may be these legal and ethical implications, but it will only get better, and our knowledge of it will also get better.
Yeah. Maybe it's worth checking in at this point about what it is that law departments are currently using AI for.
Yeah, absolutely. And some statistics. So from our conversations, basically everybody who we have spoken to is using some form of AI in their daily legal practice. Some recent research shows that about 50% of in-house counsel are actively using AI in their daily work, which is incredible. Now, I'd say that the majority of these users would be what we would call nascent users of AI. So using ChatGPT or Claude or some other commercial product in a fairly ad hoc or unstructured way. Some of the larger legal teams have developed customized GPTs or private GPTs. Private GPTs in particular are great because they're hosted on their infrastructure, and so they overcome some of those privacy or confidentiality issues. And then businesses, larger businesses with larger in-house teams with tech capability are also starting to explore integrating AI into workflows or maybe even like LegalVision. This is the way that we utilize it. So we have a private GPT that we use, which is highly customized. And we also, and so this is on our infrastructure. So again, completely safe from a data and a privacy perspective, a confidentiality perspective. But we also leverage a technique called retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, which is effectively a way of being able to take this private GPT, really design prompts that are highly technical but also very effective, but then also utilize playbooks or precedents or really good quality, legally correct information to be able to generate really high quality outputs.
Yeah. So there's a lot of benefits that law departments are currently seeing from their uses of AI.
Totally. And so regardless of sort of where you are in terms of those stages, so we went from, people who are kind of using it in an ad hoc or fairly unstructured way, all the way through to having a really detailed strategic plan around usage, there are benefits. And I suppose some of the really specific use cases that we're seeing fall within around 4 buckets. So you would have in-house teams using it for initial legal research, which we know that these models are particularly good for, and in a quite general and broad sense. Doc comparison, for example, comparing two leases or comparing a heads of agreement and a lease. Summarization, so taking complex legislation or case law or complex documentation and summarizing it and providing some high-level analysis, and then also initial doc reviews and drafting. So, there is a fair amount of benefit, and some studies that I see show that, we're seeing somewhere between 34 to 110% increase in productivity in certain use cases, which is amazing.
Yeah. Obviously, we're going to get into some of the key considerations that these legal teams have to have to explore, in order to uphold, the professional duties, for example, and cut costs, be more efficient. But broadly speaking, and based on the conversations you've had on this roadshow that LegalVision undertook, do you get the sense that law departments across the country feel as though they're in a better position compared to where they were before the age of AI?
That's a good question. I would say that certainly there's been more of a sentiment shift there's certainly been a sentiment shift for all in-house legal teams. I would say for the smaller in-house legal teams or the sole in-house lawyer, there probably hasn't been as seismic a shift. And we know that for majority of the in-house legal teams, they are on that smaller end, and they are time constrained, and they do have budgetary constraints. And so they're probably not seeing as big a benefit as the bigger end of town. Now, one thing I would say, and this is really important, is that, and I have certainly noticed this in my role as head of legal and GM at LegalVision, the expectation of in-house counsel and their relationships with external counsel has fundamentally changed. So I am seeing clients come to LegalVision and say that they're not particularly happy with traditional law firms or the traditional billable model. They know that this particular work could be done more efficiently and cost effectively through the use of good systems, process and tech. And so we are seeing this shift there as well. So even if in-house teams aren't capable of leveraging this technology in-house for whatever reason, they can still put a bit of pressure on their external, their strategic advisors to be able to derive those benefits.
Yeah. Well, that probably offers us a nice segue into talking about some of the legal considerations when using these Gen AI tools, in their corporate function. So would you mind running us through some of those key considerations?
Yeah, of course. Look, I won't go into too much detail on some of this stuff because there's a lot there. I would say at a really high level, in Australia, the law is largely playing catch-up. We're not as advanced as, say, for example, the EU, but I'll touch a little bit about some of the legislation there. But in saying that, in Australia, it's not an entirely lawless space. So there is still legislation there that we do need to be very, very mindful of. And then when LegalVision is advising our clients on the ethical and lawful use of AI, the sorts of things we're advising them on fall within four general buckets. The first is privacy and data. So in terms of big concerns there around compliance with the Australian privacy principles, particularly when uploading personal information or sensitive information into public AI systems. And we know that the OAIC has released guidance around that. And largely, looking at ensuring that there is transparency and consent. But I would also note, if you are going to be using private models, be sure to get legal advice before starting to insert personal or sensitive information into it. The second is around IP ownership of outputs. This is a bit of a complex area. If you're using a commercial AI tool, it will typically set out ownership rights. However, that might be very different to copyright law in Australia, which, as we know, in order to be protected under copyright law, creative works generally need to be original and created by a human. Sure. So there are natural complications there when dealing with AI systems. And then IP infringement. So this is particularly the case where an AI model will spit out content and some or all of it may be completely plagiarized. So just being completely mindful of that. And the other thing that we're typically advising our clients on are things like acceptable use policies and how to ensure that they can put guardrails and guidances around the use of AI within their businesses.
broadly speaking, and I certainly hope this doesn't come across as potentially denigrating to law departments across the country, but do you get the sense that, painting a broad brush, that in-house legal teams are cognizant of all of these legal considerations and obligations, or are they perhaps playing a bit of catch-up?
I think they're very cognizant of it. No, and that's just my general sense. They are very aware that, A, they have their professional and ethical obligations, which I'm sure we'll get to, but there are these legal considerations, and these are the ones that come up whenever we have conversations with in-house counsel about the use of AI, and they'll say, oh, what about privacy, or what about IP, or what about confidentiality? So it's very, very front of mind, and it's causing a little bit of, hesitance.
Yeah, or just on that point about the hesitance, I mean, are you finding that law departments are perhaps struggling to keep up, with adhering to all of these legal obligations, whilst also upskilling and being able to utilize, these AI platforms to the best of their ability?
I would say it would be just a challenge for them to be able to not only educate themselves on the different AI tools out there and what are the pros and cons of each of the tools, what are the use cases that will work best for them, how they can get the best out of the AI tools, but then also thinking about, okay, well, what are all of the ethical obligations that come with it? What are all the legal obligations? And so keeping abreast of that. And not to mention that this is obviously a shifting space. As I mentioned, there is legislation over in the EU, which sets an interesting framework, which might translate to legislation in Australia at some point. But it's just inevitable that there will be legislative change at some point in Australia. And so I think the key message there is just keep educated, maybe even go to the Corporate Counsel Summit just to keep abreast of some of these issues, but also listening to your podcast. And I think I get the majority of my information from following some really key people on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a really great way of keeping on top of some of these topics. But yeah, I would say that it is I suppose it's just another thing to add to the plate of in-house counsel who already are wearing so many different hats and are expected to, know so much and do so much. Yeah.
Well, let's add another hat to them right now. Let's talk about some of the ethical and professional considerations that have to be part and parcel of any check-in that a law department is doing.
Yeah, sure. So at these on this roadshow or these in-house counsel roundtables that we've been having on the topic of what the ethical considerations are, definitely professional obligations do come up, as you would expect, having a lunch with a bunch of lawyers. So things like duties to courts, duties to clients, upholding the integrity and confidence in the profession, all of those things just naturally come up at a really high level. And then there are issues around how do you maintain confidentiality and privilege, etc. But I think most of our lawyers would probably be pretty familiar with that. But by far, and this is super interesting, Jerome, by far the most common ethical concerns raised by more senior in-house lawyers falls within two questions or two issues. And the first, every time we've had one of these sessions, this topic has come up, and it's how to ensure that junior lawyers are getting the experience and the technical training that they need in the age of AI. And the second, which I think is super interesting, is at what point will it become almost unethical or negligent to not be using AI in the delivery of legal services, which I find super interesting.
No, absolutely, and just raises so many leadership questions around, how are you training up the next generation of lawyers as well? Obviously, they need to be technologically and technically proficient, but are we, maybe losing certain water cooler conversations, for, how, our generations before us, were trained when they went into law firms or in-house teams. It's really tough for GCs and CLOs right now.
Totally. And look, when I started in the profession, we were just shifting away from using dictaphones, and we were all starting to learn how to speed type, and so there has always been eras of transformation in the in the industry. Realistically, and this is just my opinion, but realistically, the role of the in-house lawyer and in-house practice is going to significantly change. I mentioned previously that I believe that the role of in-house lawyer will be certainly more strategic, more proactive, less about being bogged down in the routine and the reactive BAU. And so therefore the skills of tomorrow are not going to be about how effectively you can Boolean search or how effective your cross-referencing skills are, but more likely to be around prompt engineering and stakeholder management and negotiation, and then how you can look at a legal problem, identify the legal issues, and then come up with really intelligent, creative solutions. So I think our junior lawyers are going to be okay.
With that fundamental shift that you mentioned there, are we able to say whether or not this is a good thing, that the role of the in-house lawyer is going to change so much? Or is it simply just the reality on the ground that circumstances are dictating that such shifts must occur and we just all have to get on with it?
I think it's more of the latter. I mean, this is just sort of the reality of where the industry is going to. There have been pressures. I mean, we spoke about it the last time we caught up on the podcast about the pressures that in-house counsel have had over many years now about doing more with less, about demonstrating value to the business, about how they can increase productivity. There's also challenges around attracting and retaining talent. So all of these problems, in theory, can be solved by new technologies that can help in-house legal teams just do all of those things, do their job, but potentially better.
Yeah, I want to circle back to how the role will continue to change, but I want to touch base on how in-house teams can be navigating all of these risks and challenges and considerations that we've been fleshing out, whilst also ensuring that they're gaining the requisite benefit from their use of AI and other new technologies. I think legal teams have long been, unfairly tarred with the brush that they can be a bit of a handbrake on business activity, whether it's by, the sales team or marketing team or whoever else. And maybe now, because there's all these perceptions of lawyers' use of AI, that they're going to be able to turn over work, within a minute, again, if the lawyer is there saying, no, there are legal and ethical considerations we have to factor in here, that again, they may be perceived as a bit of a handbrake. But of course, lawyers have their professional duties that they need to uphold. They need to ensure that the business is adhering to the letter of the law. So what's the balance here? How can they navigate those risks, but also ensure that everyone is able to flourish?
Yeah, of course. And look, I think what's super important, and just going back to first principles, number one is education, making sure that you're really clear on what those legal and ethical and compliance issues are. Number two, getting familiar with the technology and what it can and can't do. Because as I mentioned before, the technology can do some things really well and other things not so well. Number three is also, and I might touch upon some of the EU legislation now, because I think it really does provide a bit of a framework for us to consider these ethical and legal issues. So the EU last year passed the Artificial Intelligence Act. It's a super interesting piece of legislation. It's worth going on ChatGPT and asking a summary on it. Okay. But the legislation takes a risk-based approach to the management of AI, and it bans certain AI use cases. And unsurprisingly, it's things like AI that manipulates people's decision-making or predicts that an individual is going to commit a criminal offence. And then it also categorizes certain activities which are high risk and imposes some obligations on it. But what I think is most interesting about the EU legislation is some of the fundamental principles underpinning it. And I think that it should be the fundamental principles that underlie good governance and the way people should be, for example, designing their acceptable use policies for AI. And those principles are, firstly, transparency. So if you're going to be using AI systems, or if decisions are going to be made by AI, it's really important that you are transparent and open about it. And that, I think, is part and parcel also of our professional duties and obligations. Number two, data governance or data integrity. Super important in terms of ensuring that any AI systems that you are using is trained, or it's using really high quality data sets, ideally legally trained, or even using that RAG or retrieval augmented generation that I mentioned before. That will help avoid inaccuracies, but really important, also minimize potential biases, which we know underscores a lot of the data sets that we're seeing at the moment. The third is always having human oversight. Human oversight is critical in terms of keeping humans in decision-making loops, but also from a legal perspective, you need to make sure that you're reviewing everything that's generated by AI, because we know that it's not perfect. We know that it hallucinates. We know that there are certain lawyers who have been hauled over the coals for submitting court documents with false citations. So please do not be the lawyer that sets us back 4 or 5 years, 10 years by misusing misusing these tools. So human oversight, super important. And then, of course, robustness, making sure when you're using this technology, you're being safe, secure, and you're not allowing it to be misused for purposes, for incorrect purposes.
Yeah, those are all really important and necessary practical steps. So thank you for outlining those. But just zooming out a bit, I'm curious to know if you think there are also some fundamental, potentially philosophical questions that law departments should be asking of themselves at this critical juncture, so that they can better understand the why around implementing the steps that you just listed. And because my thinking is that if they know the why and they have this clear mission around why they are striking the right balance when in using AI and then navigating the risks, that it'll make it a lot easier for them to not only deal with their internal colleagues in the other business functions, but also so they can better collaborate with their external providers like LegalVision.
So I suppose starting firstly with why we want to implement this technology in the first place, and that's because there is a hypothesis that this technology is going to enable us to deliver legal services perhaps more efficiently, more cost effectively, perhaps even eventually at a higher quality than we currently have. And so ultimately that's going to be a good thing, not only for in-house counsel, but also the business stakeholders who they're serving. But also we really need to keep in mind all of our professional duties and obligations. They don't go away just because we have AI. So we need to make sure that we're using it in a really ethical and compliant manner. And I wanted to stress, and this was a point that I mentioned before, and this is a question that's been coming up time and time again in our roundtables. At what point will it become almost unethical or negligent to not use AI? And I think it's an interesting question because, while we're certainly not there yet, and it's not a short to medium term thing, there is certainly, in my opinion, a foreseeable future version of our industry where it would be almost unethical for lawyers to not utilize AI, because it is either more efficient, more cost effective, or even more technically accurate or prudent to do so. And that's not to say AI is ever going to replace human judgment. There is always going to need to be a human in the loop. There's going to need to be oversight, a technical expert who can assess to make sure that it is all legally correct and accurate. However, we've seen it, and we have certainly seen this in other industries. Take the autopilot in the aviation industry, for example. It is regulated that autopilot must be used during cruising or when ascending or descending, and it's actually it would be negligent for a pilot to not use autopilot, except for very specific circumstances. So the profession, I think, does need to consider how does it eventually adapt to a world where it may be unethical to not use AI or not legally prudent to not use AI.
No, fair enough. So if a law department is able to successfully strike the right balance between utilizing AI but also navigating the legal, ethical, professional risks that are inherent with such use, what do you see as being the look or the makeup of a successful department by 2030?
2030, I love it.
or even by next year. Given the pace and volume of change, what will constitute success by that time?
Yeah, look, I think that even looking at it probably in a more shorter time frame, I think it's definitely educating yourself on the different tools that are out there, which is really important. Ensure that you're playing with it now, but also getting familiar with the types of use cases and what the technology is good for and what it doesn't do so well. But acknowledging that will change. And I'll mention it again. This is the worst that the tech is going to be. It's only going to get better from here. The third is definitely staying on top of those ethical, legal compliance questions and putting in place a good, acceptable use policy for your team, but also for the broader business. I would say that that ethical use policy should have those underlying principles that I was mentioning before around transparency, about keeping a human in the loop, about robustness, and about the integrity of the data, amongst other things. I would also really think, I think that the legal team of the future as well is going to have a very different relationship with their external legal provider. And I mentioned this previously, but I've already seen a shift that GCs are coming to LegalVision and saying, I like what you do. I know that you're using system, process, and tech. I know that you can do this piece of work at the same quality but at a fraction of the cost as traditional law. And so I would suspect that in the future, that relationship with external law firms is also going to dramatically change. So yeah, I would. It would be very difficult for me to say what the best, what the legal team of the future is going to look like in 2030. But I reckon over the next couple of years, it's going to look a little bit more like that.
Well, Manny, I've really enjoyed having this conversation with you, and I'm certainly looking forward to hearing more from LegalVision on these matters at our upcoming Corporate Counsel Summit. For those listeners who maybe haven't bought a ticket yet, why should they do so? What will they get to hear from you guys at that event?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, the Corporate Counsel Summit is always a fantastic event. I love attending. You'll be hearing from Joanne Chen. Joanne is our Strategy and Legal Operations Manager at LegalVision. Super experienced in this space and has been spearheading the rollout of AI at LegalVision, and so very knowledgeable on all things, not only about the ethical and legal implications and also professional duties of lawyers. Joanne is a lawyer or former lawyer, recovering lawyer.
Reformed lawyer.
That's a better one. Reformed lawyer. But also she has a lot of knowledge on the most effective ways of being able to implement it as well, both for legal teams but also for in-house counsel. So it'll make for a fantastic conversation.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly looking forward to it. No doubt our attendees will be also. Emmanuel Giuffre, thank you so much for coming back on the show, and thank you once again to LegalVision.
Thanks, Jerome.
And thank you to the listener for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we certainly hope to see you at our upcoming Corporate Counsel Summit. Cheers.